So the Best of Bristol lectures are a way to showcase the fantastic teaching that goes on at the university. They're a student-run initiative previously funded by the Alumni Foundation, but now funded by BILT, the Bristol Institute of Learning and Teaching. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Gareth Griffith, a senior teaching associate in the Department of English. After studying at Oxford, Gareth worked at an aid and development charity before coming to Bristol in 2003 to complete his master's, followed by his PhD from 2004 to 2008. Since 2005, Gareth has been teaching in the Department of English, and now, as well as tutoring and lecturing, he's responsible for the organisation of the BA in English, Literature and Community Engagement, a 6-year part-time degree course for mature students. Gareth specialises in medieval literature and has lectured me on topics including Chaucer, Malory, and Middle English grammar. For many students, medieval literature can be a challenging area. One of my friends described it as troublesome and dry. So you might wonder why we nominated a medievalist to give a Best of Bristol lecture. Well, the answer to that lies in Gareth's fun, engaging, and incisive lecturing style. When I ask people about, to give me a couple of words and quotes about Gareth, the majority of things that came through were that his lectures are fun, he's very funny, he tells jokes, he makes things interesting, and he's truly passionate about his subject. And I think this is evident in the way he speaks, and I think you'll soon find that out. He's certainly the only lecturer I've ever had who's played Gershwin's I've Got Rhythm at the end of a lecture on poetic rhythm and meter. So, without further ado, I'm going to stop speaking. I hope you enjoy this afternoon's lecture, and please join with me in welcoming Dr. Gareth Griffiths.
Thank you. Am I on? Is that all right? Great. This is a bit unusual. It's not unusual for me to lecture walking around. It is unusual for me to do that with a script in my hand, and I was hoping I'd have the safety of a lectern to protect myself behind. But I thought if I do that, then you good people who've come over this side might not see me as much, and you may not think that's a bad thing, but I thought, why should these people over this side have to do all the suffering? So I'm going to move around a little bit with a text in my hand, if that's okay. So thank you, Ross. Thank you, full staff, for putting me in this predicament and for organising the decoration purely for me. And thank you for everybody in the Best of Bristol committee for sorting this out and getting me here. I'm very grateful that you've chosen to take a chance on me. And there aren't that many jokes in this, I'm afraid, but there might be something else going on if you listen out carefully as we go through. So let me start by asking you 4 questions, and these are rhetorical questions, so any answers you shout out will be ruthlessly edited out of the recording, or, as I prefer to think of it, the live album. First question: how did the Roman Emperor Vespasian get his name? Question number 2: what is the moral significance of hunting elephants? Question number 3: what is sex for? Now I've got your interest, haven't I? Number 4: how do you know what you believe? Now, I'm going to answer all of those questions before I sit down, but for a long while in the last few weeks, I've been worried about another question, which is, when I'm standing here, what am I going to say? What do you do in a Best of Bristol lecture? And there'd be a logic in, if you've been asked to do this on the basis of what you've done before, do more of the same. But 3 of the lectures I've given this year have been on Middle English grammar, and I wasn't convinced that other people would agree with me about the mass appeal of split-heavy groups and the ethic dative. So, for some reason, I decided not to talk about that. So instead, I want to step back a little bit, metaphorically, rather than physically, now that I'm moving around. And I want to think about 2 other questions. Firstly, what is the value in studying literature from the past? And secondly, who should do that? And they come to mind because these are questions that I have to confront daily in my job. As a researcher, why should I take any care at all to investigate old books? And when I write about that research, who is my audience? Who should I be thinking of as using that information? And then when I'm teaching, is it fair of me to repay the time, the effort, the energy that at least some of my students, all my students put in to studying? Is it fair to repay that by asking them to deal with old, difficult to read texts that are very distant from their own lived experience, and texts that are concerned with issues that my students, frankly, might feel a profound indifference towards? And then lastly, as a program director for a BA course, which is exclusively for mature students studying part-time, well, what's the rationale for making them undergo the study of old text? They are making huge sacrifices to study at all, rushing here from work and from family commitments. Why do I then put Spencer or Chaucer in front of them? So put these questions together and you start to wonder, what are we supposed to be doing here? What's the name of the game? Well, we could be pragmatic. We could say simply, I do these things because I'm paid to, and if I don't get paid. And you, as a student, you do these things because a degree gives you an advantage in the job market. It increases your likely earning power. But I don't think it's all about money, money, money. Because there are wider and deeper benefits to reading texts from the past. Now, one argument that's often used in this context is that texts from the past can give a kind of revealing perspective on interests that we in the present are interested in. So in 1964, the Polish critic Jan Kot, I think I pronounced his name correctly there, published this book, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, in which he argued that Shakespeare's analyses of power, especially political power, were directly relevant to the political upheavals in Eastern Europe in the 20th century, that they made sense of them, that perhaps they offered a means of resisting tyranny in the 20th century. And similarly, in 1978, the American historian Barbara Tuchman published a book called A Distant Mirror, which was a study of the 14th century that, as its title suggests, was intended at least partly to see how the later Middle Ages might reflect Tuchman's own historical moment. These are two classic and, in some ways, dated studies, but this approach, studying the past because of its usefulness to the present, often resurfaces. It resurfaces on blogs, on funding bids, it resurfaces in tutorials. It's a justification for studying the past. Now, do I agree with it? Well, yes, I do. But there is, some of you are cottoning on. There is, for example, there's this excellent blog by Paul Sturtevant. Again, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name correctly. But he uses a very wide and distinguished scholarship to critique the ways in which the Middle Ages are used, even now, in public discourse. And he seeks to correct misremembering and misrepresentation of the past. And I think that is a valid and important reason for doing medieval studies, or historical or literary studies more generally. But today, I want to argue in favour of a different reason, a reason which is almost the opposite of that. I'm interested in literature from the past, and I'm committed to studying it with as many people as I can, precisely because those texts often have preoccupations that are very different from my own. Or where those preoccupations overlap, these old texts approach them with very different presumptions and ways of thinking from my own. So this is an approach to the past which sees its value not in similarity, in contact to the present, but in difference, in strangeness. And whether that difference is simply entertaining, as I often find it to be, or, as I also often find it to be, profoundly troubling. Now, I want to underline here before my colleagues in the department who've kindly turned out to support me today think that, getting the idea that I think only medieval literature can do this. I don't. I think the same applies to older literature, classical literature if you like, and more recent literature. And I also think you can make a very important argument that the same kind of travelling out of your cultural moment can be done geographically, that you can go and read texts from outside your own geographical area. In each case, the value lies in stepping outside your cultural moment. It just so happens that what I deal with is medieval literature, so that's what I'm going to be speaking about. So let me give you some examples of the kind of strangeness that you can find in medieval texts. And I'm going to begin by starting to answer the first of those four questions that I began with. How did the Roman Emperor Vespasian get his name? Now, for the answer to that, we need to turn to a poem from the second half of the 14th century, probably the 1370s or 1380s, which is called The Siege of Jerusalem. There's a page from one of the manuscripts that survives. This poem is one of several medieval accounts of the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in 70 CE, a campaign that was led by the Roman general Titus, who later succeeded his father Vespasian as emperor. Now, the poet of this Middle English account, as with a number of other medieval accounts, reads the Roman campaign as a kind of holy war, waged by a Roman Empire that prefigures the Roman Church of his own day. And it's a campaign waged against the Jewish nation as divine punishment for their having crucified Christ. The fact that it was the Romans who actually convicted and executed Jesus is conveniently ignored. But why, from the poet's point of view, why would these pagan Romans act as champions of Christendom? Surely that would take a miracle. Well, actually, it takes two. It's the miraculous healing of both Titus and his father that causes this to happen. Titus is healed from a cancer which was deforming his face, and Vespasian is healed from this. A bicker of waspen bears bred in his nose, heaved upon his head, he had him of youth, and Vespasian was called, the waspin of bees after. A hive of wasp bees bred in his nose, hived up in his head. He had them since his youth, and was called Waspasian, after the wasp bees. And that's obviously, I think, a bit ridiculous. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not true, although I did find this image of Vespasian. So maybe this is, maybe until now we finally discovered this. But actually it depends simply on the similarity between the Latin name Vespasianus and the Latin word for wasp, which is vespa. Now this poet of this poem isn't the first to suggest this false etymology. It's very popular in the Middle Ages because, well, why? Well, because it sounds plausible. It's entertaining. And no one can prove it's not the case. It's also very useful for the story that the poet wants to tell about things. And it fits in with an assumption about the world that is very widespread in the period, the assumption that the world is logical, and that logic extends even to names. Things have meaning, they have origins, they can be explained. So put like that, the thinking behind the bizarre etymology here begins to make sense to us. It can even be similar to ways that we might think about the world as being interpretable. Well, what about the second question? What is the moral significance of hunting elephants? Well, we could all give a modern answer to that, I expect, but I want to give an answer from one of the medieval bestiaries. And in case you don't know, these are very popular forms of text. They're part natural history, but more than that, they're morality. And they list various animals which, with a kind of brief sketch of their chief characteristics, and then they offer the reader or hearer a moral that they should draw from the body or the behaviour of each animal. And in most cases, the things that the bestiaries have to say about each animal are, well, at best surprising and at worst pure moonshine. In this case, the case I want to talk about, the case of an elephant. The bestiary in this manuscript, this is Arundel 292, which comes from the last quarter of the 13th century. I'm afraid the text is too long to quote in full, so you're going to have to trust me on this one. But this bestiary explains that elephants are so big and so heavy that once they've fallen over, they can't get up on their own. For this reason, it says, they have to sleep by leaning against a tree. So the obvious question is, well, how do you hunt an elephant? And surely it's obvious. All you do is find out which tree it likes to go to sleep against. And then you take a saw and you cut almost all the way through it. And then you wait. And sooner or later, the elephant comes along, leans against the tree without seeing that you've cut halfway through it, and of course the tree collapses. The elephant is now on the ground, and the elephant, as we know, is too big and too heavy to get up on its own. You have caught your elephant. But it's not quite game over for our pachydermous friend. I'm delighted, by the way, to finally have the chance to say the word pachydermous in public. The bestiary explains that what happens next is that other elephants come along. There he is, leaning against the tree, which is cut through, just before the big crash moment. And other elephants, once he's on the ground, other elephants come along and they try to lift him back up, which sadly they will be unable to do until they all together make a loud trumpeting call, and one young elephant will come along. He will link trunks with the fallen elephant, as you can sort of see happening there, and he will then be able to lift him up. And you can relax because the sadness is over. Well, it's all rather fanciful, but if you think just a little bit more, it's not that difficult, actually, to reconstruct how a story like that gets put together. Elephants are big. If you've ever seen an elephant, that's the first thing you'll know about it. And if you've not seen one, it's probably the first thing you'll be told about it. And a big animal you'd expect to be ungainly. You'd expect it to have difficulty getting up. And then you think about that a bit longer and you think, well, then how does it sleep? Because I lie down to sleep. If an elephant can't get down and get up easily, how does it sleep? Well, you might think that it does what human beings sometimes do. If they're jammed in so tightly they can't sit down or lie down, they lean against something and go to sleep. And you might think, well, what happens then when this elephant is leaning against something? What's it got to lean against? I know, a tree. But elephants are really heavy. What happens if when it leans against that tree it falls over? Game over for the elephant. In fact, if you've ever actually seen elephants, you might see that they do knock trees over. David Attenborough told me this on television, and I believe him. So far, so logical. And elephants are also very sociable animals. They can be. You can get lone elephants in certain parts of Africa, but they tend to be sociable. So if you happen to see a standing elephant using its trunk to touch another elephant who is lying down, you can see how someone starts to think, well, it's trying to pull it up. And if that sounds implausible to you, all you need to do is go to a zoo, stand in front of an animal cage, and wait till someone comes along next to you and starts to explain to their family or friend or child exactly why the animals are doing what they're doing. It's a very natural human impulse. So if you go through that process, you start to see how an idea that we now rightly reject can come into existence in a way that we can recognize as, in some sense, logical. You can follow the process. But the question was about the morality of hunting elephants, and here things take a rather different turn. You see, for bestiary writers, the moral question wasn't how should we behave towards elephants, but what can the behavior of the elephant teach us about morals? And in this case, as I'm sure you can imagine, the elephant is a living emblem of Adam. Why? Well, because his fall was also brought about by a tree. And after humanity had fallen, other human effort tried to lift us up again. So, for example, Moses giving the law. But none of us is able to keep the law. We can't lift up our humanity. You see, we're like those elephants. Until a whole group of human beings get together, the prophets, and they trumpet out, and the young Christ comes to lift us up again. And now we have learnt the moral lesson of the elephant, which I'm sure now seems perfectly obvious to you, and you're kicking yourself that you didn't think of it sooner. Well, okay, maybe that moralizing is a further stretch. It's a different stage of medieval strangeness for us. But as we try to understand how anyone could conceive a story like that, we start to appreciate the very different outlook on the world that lies behind it. It presupposes the universe is not just interpretable, but a living collection of moral exemplar. It sees everything around us as susceptible of moral interpretation, and that moral interpretation is the most important thing about everything. And it's very anthropocentric. The function of the rest of the universe is to teach human beings like us moral and theological lessons. Now, those are probably not assumptions that we would share, but if we reflect on them, we can start to interrogate the ways that we do interpret the natural world. There's been a shift, I think, in natural history documentaries in the way that animals are taught of as having emotions, or whether they behave in family groups. Why do we do that? What is the right way of saying that? This medieval strangeness gives us a point of comparison. But sometimes there is an overlap between the things that the medieval text is interested in and things that interest us, which brings us a third kind of strangeness, a strangeness of approach. And that brings me to my third question. What is sex for? Now, I don't know how you would answer that question, obviously. It'd be a bit disturbing if I did, really, wouldn't it? But the variety of answers in medieval literature is wide enough that I can be fairly sure at least some of them are ones that you wouldn't give. So, for example, the Morte d'Arthur, Sir Thomas Malory's great 15th century prose romance of King Arthur, is, I think, rather uncomfortable with the idea that sex is a natural expression of heterosexual love. In a famous passage, he laments that nowadays men cannot love 7 nights, but they must have all their desires. You go either way on that. Some people are thinking 7 nights is not very long. Other people are thinking 7 nights. Split the room. But in contrast, says Malory, the old love was not so. For men and women could love together 7 years, and no lecherous lust was betwixt them. And then was love, truth, and faithfulness. The implication is that sex can go with love, but that it need not, and that love that needs sex is in some sense not proper love. You'll find a much more varied set of approaches to sex in Chaucer's poetry, and as I say that, I tread carefully because I know there's at least one person in this room who's much more expert than I am. On Chaucer, I mean, rather than sex. But although, anyway. So in the Canterbury Tales, you can find the kind of almost sexless love that Malory seems to advocate. I think the Knight's Tale is a lot about love and very little about sex, on the surface at least. But there is also sex as a domestic bargaining tool, especially for a woman. Sex as good fun, especially for a woman. Sex as reward, sex as violent assault, and you can find all of those in The Wife of Bath's prologue or her tale. In the marriage night bed of The Merchant's Tale, you find sex as disappointment, perhaps even sex as boredom, especially for a woman. And sex is often a form of game. Or in The Shipman's Tale, sex is a form of economic exchange, almost a form of accountancy. Some of those approaches to sex may seem either personally or experientially familiar. Others are, I hope, not part of your experience at all. But for the most radiant description of sex in Chaucer, I think you have to go to Troilus and Criseyde. And this is a long poem about doomed love. That sounds like a blurb, but it really is in a way, which is set in the context of the Trojan War. And it traces the story of its two title characters from their initial falling for each other through to their final separation, betrayal, and death. Sorry, spoilers. But right in the heart of the poem, physically in the heart of the poem, is their first night in bed together. O blissful nicht of hem so long isocht, how blithe unto them both two thou were. We nad I switch on with me soul i bocht, yea, or the least joy that was there. O why thou fool of danger and thou fear, and let them in this heaven of bliss dwell that is so high that all ne can tell. Sex here is blissful. It's almost mystical. It's a heavenly bliss. It's indescribable, in spite of the fact that Chaucer takes two stanzas of rhyme royal to describe what can't be described. But it's well worth buying, even at the cost of your own soul. And in the stanza before this one, it's a feast, it's a playing. Lovers consume, they have fun, they damn themselves at the same time that they rise to heaven. It's complex, it's contradictory, it's affirming, and it's joyful, which I think is something to set against how sex often gets portrayed in our own moment. Sex isn't the only question or topic where medieval answers can challenge modern assumptions or push us to interrogate them. I mentioned the public medievalist. I'm not being paid by him, by the way. But there's an excellent series that's still going on this blog, and there was about medieval studies and racism. And earlier this month it ran this piece, Were Medieval People Racist? And his answer is yes, many were, but perhaps not in the same ways that modern people tend to be. And in the process, this unpacks the ways in which the very notion of race is socially and historically constructed. Usually, race is invented in order to discriminate and abuse. And looking at the strangeness of the ways in which that's done in the Middle Ages helps us, I think, by contrast, to see more clearly how it's done in our own time, which in turn makes us that much better equipped to challenge it and cut off racist patterns of thought and behaviour at the source. So there are different kinds of medieval strangeness, and they are useful in different ways. There is a value simply in the delightful oddness of old books. Medieval strangeness can challenge our assumptions about pertinent issues, but there is more to it than that, even. I suppose my key point is that I want to argue that by developing the habit of engaging with odd ideas, like the ones I've discussed so far, we improve our ability to make sense of views we disagree with, and which initially seem to us to be mad or incomprehensible. And that, it seems to me, has a value as a partial response to a problem much commented on in recent months, the echo chamber of my title. There was some confusion when I suggested the title to the committee about what it means, so I probably ought to explain it. Here are some examples, and you can see these are headlines from recent months. Some go back as far as 2015. It's often used in relation to social media, and the basic idea is that the world we encounter online is often lacking in diversity. It simply reflects back our own opinions to us over and over again, on and on and on. And this was a subject of a recent report by the Demos think tank. Its author, Alex Krasodomski-Jones, comments on the phenomenon like this. This is published last month. In the wake of the year's major political and cultural events, the way we use the internet to inform our news and views has been questioned. The charge levelled at the great online content providers is this, that their platforms are built to over-provide users with information they agree with, or even to suppress the content they do not. With so much of our politics now playing out online, critics have claimed that this kind of confirmation bias is causing the balkanization of political discussion, a strengthening of existing biases and political prejudices, and a narrowing of political, cultural, and social awareness. So if I customize the news I receive on my BBC News app, if I choose on Twitter only to follow people I like and admire and agree with, if Facebook's knowledge of the things I like and the links I click through only shows me stories I already want to read, and if Amazon only ever recommends me to read books that are like books I've already read, then I'm increasingly insulated from difference, from disagreement, and from different ways of seeing the world. Now, it's not inevitable. We can choose to seek out other points of view in all of those ways and more. But my guess is that in practice, if we're using the internet for recreation, and the research suggests that more and more of us are doing that more and more, it's unlikely that I will actively choose to be challenged and contradicted in my leisure time. I'm far more likely to seek reassurance and validation by encountering a reflection of my own ideas and preferences. So my interaction with others through the internet, in effect, are only about knowing me. Knowing you, whoever you are, is unlikely to happen. I'm proud of that one. It's unlikely to happen unless I make a conscious effort to do so. I have to seek out difference because I'm not going to encounter it by accident. And that leaves me with two urgent needs. One is to encounter ways of seeing the world that are different from my own. And the other is, when I do that, to learn how to engage productively with those other viewpoints, which is where I come back to me being a medievalist, because I think reading old books helps us to do this, because it forces us to encounter strange ways of seeing the world. And if I'm going to engage with those books properly, I need to work hard at understanding how a worldview which is so strange to me is apparently so natural to somebody else, the people who make the text. But there's one other dimension to how studying literature of the past can stretch me. It's not just something that comes from the books. It also comes from those who study with me. Reading is not actually solitary. Sometimes it is in part, but it involves others, it affects others. The things I read change my interaction with other people. And the richest reading happens when we make that communal effect an active part of the reading that we do, which is, after all, why we have tutorials. And some of the most productive and rewarding tutorials I've been a part of have revolved around intense disagreement between students in the room over whether the wife of Bath is a feminist icon or not, over whether Marlowe's Dr. Faustus is a hero or an idiot. It's great, you just wind up the question and you let them go. And that kind of debate and disagreement should mean, and in my experience does mean, that we all understand the text more richly as a result, and we see more possibilities in it. And therefore, good education, good learning, good research doesn't just permit what we call diversity, it demands it. The idea that university was only suitable for, say, 5% of people, which is the number of 17 to 30-year-olds who apparently went to university in 1960, that idea has largely been blown out of the water. The numbers have been going up. Here you see that in 2015, I think the most recent figures I had, that's a different projection, but in 2015, 31% of 18-year-olds apparently went to university. And you know what? It turns out they do just fine there. That extra 26% would have been okay at any point. I'd love to see that number rise and rise and rise. But if it's now time, if that's already been established, I think it's now time for the idea that a student will almost always be between the ages of 18 to 21. That idea needs to meet its Waterloo. It's simply not true that that is always the best time for someone to study at university. And just as we need to work towards a much deeper and wider understanding of what university is for and the good it can do besides economic good, I have a dream that we can develop a much more flexible higher education system, which isn't just fixated on some people going to university, almost all of whom only do it once and do it immediately or almost immediately after leaving school. If we can make our university community more representative of the world beyond these walls, then we all benefit. A more diverse student body brings a wider range of experience to bear on the texts we study. And as a result, we learn more. My favourite example of this was a conversation I had with a mature student who'd retired after a long and very distinguished career in the probation service. And we were talking about Shakespeare's play Othello, and there's a question in that as to why Othello goes so quickly from being loving husband to jealous killer. And it's often sort of suggested that this is just sort of dramatic convenience, it's not really plausible, it's an unreal aspect of the text. And I put this to the student, and he said to me, oh, no, not at all. Most of the murderers I've known have been exactly like that. His experience filled in for my lack of understanding, and I now understand that text much better because I studied it with him. The difficulty is those of us who end up working at university tend to be those for whom the experience of studying at university was itself enjoyable and successful. That's why we wanted to stick around. And the chances are that as we did that, we found the system we were in comparatively easy to adapt to and to fit in with. And the danger is that that unconsciously perpetuates just one model of study as the only model of study. And that excludes other types of students. If some quote-unquote non-standard students are allowed in, are they made to feel that the university belongs to them, that they are, as it were, one of us? Or are they just the visitors? It takes conscious effort and the conscious giving up of privilege and power by those of us who have it to make that kind of change happen. And it's not just the job of people like me. It is, but not just that. Because as students, you don't simply attend a university. You shape it, and you give it the character that it has. Every student at a university changes it by the fact of being there. And if you're a student here, then it ought to be different now from how it was the day before you came. That is empowering, but it's also a responsibility. And doing this is difficult, risky, and painful. I find it hard when I go into a tutorial and something I've been teaching for years, a student explains to me and points out to me, perhaps unwittingly, that I've got it wrong, that my own biases have led to how I've taught that. It's painful. We have to be open to the limitations of our perspectives and ready to change our minds. And as I've been thinking about these questions in recent weeks, I found myself coming back to the book that I take more seriously than any other. And that's a diverse group of students. Who I ironically wasn't letting into my PowerPoint slide, but let's move on. I keep coming back unbidden to these words. You've heard it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Now, nobody panic. I haven't forgotten where I am. I'm not about to deliver a sermon. I'm available for that if anyone's interested, but I'm not doing it today. But I do think that's a powerful idea, a revolutionary idea. In an age of polarised views, it's easy to love, engage with those with whom we agree. It's much harder and much more costly to do something similar with those who disagree with us. But I think it could be a very powerful thing to do, and I think the university is the perfect place to do it. I'm aware that enemy here is a strong word, and in some contexts it's too strong. It's hard to think of the author of a medieval bestiary as anybody's enemy in any sort of strong sense. Such a text, it provides strangeness, as I said, but there's no real challenge to me. And I hope that I won't have to break up too many physical fights between enemies in my tutorials, although I do think the fact that I've never had to break up one makes me wonder if I'm doing it wrong. But in the wider context in which we all live, we will encounter views directly and actively opposed to the things that we hold most important. And in that context, the language of enemies, I think, is more natural. And at the extremes, there is evil. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we just roll over and don't oppose evil with all the tools at our command, certainly not. But to love your enemy is not to deny that someone is your enemy. Their ideas are still wrong, dangerous, even abhorrent. And if they are, they still need to be challenged, opposed, and resisted. Apart from anything else, it's very hard to pursue what you believe to be right and make it happen unless you can persuade others to agree with you. And to do that, it may help you to have enough love, as it were, that you learn more about why and how they've come to see the world in such a strange way, and what it would take to change that. Well, it's only a small suggestion. I'm not naive enough to imagine that by coming into work every day and teaching Chaucer that I'm going to cure all the world's ills. But what I've tried to show is a way in which encountering these texts that are so distant from us, so alien to our way of thinking, and doing so with the most inclusive and representative set of fellow students, might just help each of us to practice that discipline in listening to other voices and seeking to understand their own internal logic. And as we do so, we'll be challenged and sometimes changed, But we will also have our convictions put on much firmer basis, which brings me to my final page and my final question, which is, how do you know what you believe? And to answer that, I want to look briefly at one of the most beautiful and astounding poems of the Middle Ages, or in fact, of any age, which is Perl. For those of you who don't know it, it survives in a single manuscript from around 1400, along with 3 other poems by the same poet, who was a genius, if ever any poet was. It's a dream vision poem, a work of almost incredible complexity and beauty, whose poetic form combines rhyme, alliteration, linking words, and number symbolism on several levels. But as well as being a highly wrought artifact in its own right, this poem is intensely moving, because it deals with the father grieving the loss of his very young daughter and attempting through the poem to come to terms with her absence, symbolised in the loss of a pearl in the opening lines. I'll leave that one for you to read. I could talk for a very long time about Perl. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to. What I want to focus on here is the way in which the poem allows the dreamer to interrogate his own feelings and his own convictions, in this case, religious convictions, and the ways in which his feelings and his convictions conflict. He's confused, he's tormented. And he works this through by a dream in which he meets his dead daughter in a vision of heaven. That's her on the far side of the bank. And it's a heaven which is decked out in gold and jewels. She is now a young woman, a bride of Christ, surrounded by bliss and undying splendor. Well, how then, if he loves her, can he possibly mourn her loss, since she's now so much happier? And he tries to be persuaded. He tries to accept that she is happier where she is, that he shouldn't mourn. And he longs to run across that river where they meet in order that he can join her in heavenly bliss. But the act of trying to cross that river makes the dream dissolve, and it leaves him awake and alone. But it hasn't all been in vain. The religious doctrines he knew before the poem began have taken on a new solidity, a new conviction. And this is the close of the poem, which you may notice at the very end repeats, slightly varied form, the poem's opening line. But now the meaning has transformed. He has become, he wants to be a pearl offered to the pleasure of his heavenly prince. But that line also sends the dreamer, and with him the reader, back to the beginning, on an endless cycle of relearning his own convictions and making them steadily more sure through the process of dialogue and being honest about difficulty. Because that too is what can happen from the experience of debate and discussion, trying to reconcile opposing views. So in this way, and in the others that I've outlined, I believe we'll find that if we're willing to listen to these voices of the past, then Perl and the other old books I've mentioned have not yet finished speaking to us, to all of us. But for the time being, I have. Hasta mañana. Thank you very much.